money. It is pickpocketing us every day. A study done in 2023 said that 85% of us in India have already felt the effects of climate change. Crazy weather, unpredictable monsoons, floods, you name it. But here is the kicker: only 41% of us actually understand what is going on. That is a huge gap. And it is more worrying because 91% of us are seriously concerned about our future. Now, here is where it really hits home. In about 6 years, climate change, and by that I mean events like extreme heat and humidity, could wipe out up to 4.5% of India's GDP. We are talking about billions lost in productivity and the potential to push millions of people back into extreme poverty by the end of the century. You get the picture. These aren't just some big scary numbers I'm throwing at you. This is some real stuff that is affecting all of us. Still thinking, so what? Can we afford to keep asking that? Let's find out today.
In 2023, India experienced an extreme weather event on 318 out of 365 days. That equates to almost a disaster a day. These weather-related disasters or extreme weather events have strong links to global warming and climate change. For example, in 2022, the heat waves experienced across northern India were found to be made 30 times more likely to occur in a world where there is global warming as compared to a world where there wouldn't be global warming. These impacts of climate change show that climate change is affecting us today, and India is an extremely climate vulnerable country, which means that the need to take action and to reduce emissions as well as adapt to the worsening impacts of climate change are more urgent than ever before.
Welcome to She Talks Green, the podcast where we break down complex ideas and discussions into simple, actionable insights. I'm your host, Arpita, and together we'll bust myths, cut through the jargon, and make it easier to talk and act on the climate crisis. Because let's face it, this isn't just a choice anymore. It's essential for our survival. Today, we are jumping right into a hot topic in the Global Climate Action, the Conference of the Parties, or COP. If you've heard of it, but you aren't sure what it is all about, you are in the right place. To help us understand what is climate change, why we should care about events like COP, and why it is such a big deal, I am joined by Avantika Goswami from the Center for Science and Environment, a leading research organization. Avantika has been deeply involved in climate discussions on the global platform, and she brings invaluable insights into how these negotiations and discussions shape our future. Welcome, Avantika, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Hi, Arpita. Thanks. Thanks for having me on here. Good to be a part of this series and excited for this discussion.
Avantika, you are right in the middle of these discussions, and you just came back from the New York Climate Week. So, before we dive into the basics of climate change and COP, would you like to share some key emerging themes that came out of these discussions that you were part of?
Yeah, absolutely. I think to get a sense of all of the different conversations that are happening on the climate front, this is be it at New York Climate Week or be it at, all the multiple, many climate conferences that take place these days. It's important to understand that climate action occurs at different levels or different layers. Of course, you have your absolute grassroots level action where have farming communities and fishing communities who are facing impacts of climate change to their livelihoods today, and they are obviously thinking through ways to protect their livelihoods, foresee and better predict extreme weather events, and so on. You have the subnational level of climate action, such as India's state action plans on climate change, You have the national level or the domestic level where country governments are thinking through, they are setting top line targets and trying to create climate plans, imperfect climate plans, but still they're trying to create sort of economy wide climate plans to kind of set the course forward. Then you have the national or multilateral layer of climate action, and that is where different discussions happen about how different countries can cooperate with one another, collaborate with one another in an ideal world to tackle the climate problem. So, internationally and perhaps subnationally to some extent, you have the private sector where there is a lot of conversation happening on different types of climate technologies and solutions. So, in terms of how more private sector financing can be brought into the climate arena to finance climate projects. I think New York Climate Week similarly was kind of a reflection of all of these different layers of climate discourse. You have, of course, a whole segment of the private sector that is thinking of new and innovative technologies, be it in terms of energy storage, be it in terms of carbon dioxide removal, and similar types of technologies that will either help with reducing greenhouse gas emissions or absorb some amount of carbon dioxide emissions. Um, you have discussions, serious discussions happening at the multilateral level. So, New York Climate Week was taking place alongside a parallel summit known as the Summit of the Future, which was convened this year, the first of its kind by the UN Secretary General. And the Summit of the Future, of course, touched on a number of different aspects of development beyond climate change. So there were questions of development financing, questions of digital security, but climate change was also one of the big focus areas. And essentially, you have kind of a renewed demand from developing countries of the world. And this was discussed even at the Summit of the Future, where developing countries are asking developed countries to take the lead in cutting their emissions and in giving them the assistance, so financing technology transfer to help them with their own emission reduction process. So many of these conversations were taking place in parallel in New York and beyond. And of course, we have COP29 coming up in Baku very soon, in a little bit over a month, where some of the more serious political negotiations and threads will continue. So that's kind of the landscape of discourse right now.
That's very helpful, Avantika. I think these are some of the most important topics that is being discussed everywhere, and we will be deep diving into the aspects of these discussions very soon. Now, let's get into the basics, Avantika. Climate change, it's a term we hear all the time, but it often feels like it's turned into a buzzword. The way it's talked about can be so overwhelming, sometimes leading to fear rather than action. Can you help us break it down? What exactly is climate change? Why does it matter so much for all of us? And what does it mean for India as well?
One of the terms often associated with the climate crisis is that it is an existential crisis. And there's people tend to become quite philosophical about it because it's like this big looming threat that you know is coming. It's probably here already, but it's a little bit abstract because the causes of it are so dispersed and the impacts of it are also so dispersed, and the time scales of the impacts. You have rapid impacts, you have slow onset impacts. So it's coming from all sides, but it's really hard to pinpoint. I'll give you the example of if you have a particular industry that is leaking, let's say, extremely harmful chemicals into a particular river and polluting a river, and the water of that river is used by a certain community for drinking water or for bathing and other purposes, or there are vital marine ecosystems, aquatic ecosystems in that water body. it's very easy to pinpoint one particular industry as the cause of that crisis, the pollution crisis, and that community that depends on that water body as the victims of that crisis. So the cause and effect is very visible. And then you can bring in the government, you can bring in activists and other stakeholders to act swiftly to ensure that the pollution is cleaned up and the situation is reversed. The problem with climate change is that the perpetrators, the polluters, are not just one entity. They are you and me to some extent, or our equivalent humans in wealthy countries. Um, a lot of the emissions that are causing climate change were emitted almost 100 years ago because greenhouse gases, once emitted, they stay in the atmosphere, particularly carbon dioxide stays in the atmosphere for more than 100 years. So the cause of climate change is very dispersed. It's mostly wealthy polluter countries, today a lot of developing countries as well. In terms of impacts, we have always had certain types of weather-related disasters. So floods, droughts, cyclones have always happened, let's say to a country like India. But what's happening today is that a lot of those extreme weather events are becoming supercharged. So they are becoming more frequent, more intense, and the impacts are becoming harsher and more widely felt. So, climate change has a relationship with making those extreme weather events harsher, more frequent, more intense. But a lot of people have trouble digesting that, despite the science being quite conclusive on that now. Because people say that we've always had floods, we've always had droughts, you know. So the impacts are being felt, but the connections are a little difficult to pinpoint. Now, in terms of taking action, it's even tougher. How do you turn off the tap on an energy source that is powering your home, that is running your refrigerator, that is helping you travel from point A to point B to get to work, get to school? And the energy sources here, the main perpetrators here, are coal, oil, and natural gas. These are the fossil fuels most responsible for causing the climate crisis, and producing and using excess amounts of these fossil fuels are what is causing this crisis. It's very difficult to turn off these vital energy sources that are basically allowing us to exist and live our daily lives. Do we stop going to work? Do we stop lighting our homes? Um, the answer is no, but the shift that is needed to turn those energy sources into cleaner sources is a huge, messy, complicated, real economy problem that governments are struggling with around the world. So, what I'm trying to say is that the reason why it's a little difficult for people to pinpoint and understand what the climate problem is, because the causes and effects and even the solutions are also very vast, very complicated and messy, a little bit difficult to pinpoint as easily as some of the other challenges that we deal with on a daily basis.
That's very helpful, Avantika. I think it puts a lot of things into perspective. But there are still many terms out there which is used when we talk about climate change. Whether it is ESG and sustainability, these are all being widely used when we talk about climate related discussions. Can you help us understand if all of this is also within the same context, or is there a difference between these terms for our people to really understand what different terms means when we talk about climate as a whole?
Part of the reason you have so many different terminologies associated with climate solutions or identifying the climate crisis, it links back to what I mentioned earlier about there being different layers of action to address climate change. When you're operating at the governmental level, you have a certain type of target setting, economic planning, strategic decision making. And that's where certain terminology comes in. So, if a country, for example, is setting a net zero target, it means that the country is hoping that by a certain target date, uh, the amount of emissions it is emitting will hopefully be equalized by an equivalent amount of emissions that it is absorbing, either through trees and forest cover or through certain technological solutions. So that's country level climate target setting, which leads to certain types of terms and narratives proliferating. Another layer of action that I mentioned earlier is the entire engagement of the private sector. And this is vital from two perspectives. One is that major companies or corporations are either using energy to produce services or using energy and materials to produce various goods. And as a result, they are contributing to the climate crisis. So they need to think about their own target setting and their own ways of measuring emissions, reporting emissions, and eventually creating plans for themselves to reduce their own footprint and emissions impact. So in the private sector space, you have a lot of terminology which comes up. One major aspect of private sector climate discourse is discussions around financing. So when you talk about ESG, essentially you have companies and the corporate sector coming up with a sort of framework in which you report your climate impact, like environmental data, social data, governance data, ESG. That data is then used by investors to decide which companies are quote unquote somewhat cleaner, which companies are more polluting. And the companies which are reporting cleaner, better impact through their ESG data could then be attract investors who are looking to invest in those cleaner companies. So a lot of such frameworks have been set up around the world to help the private sector decarbonize and reduce its emissions. And that's led to the proliferation of a lot of these terms that are commonly thrown around. But honestly, I would say, yes, some of the terms and terminology are equivalent to greenwashing in a sense when they are not used in the right context or when they are kind of thrown about frivolously. But also, a lot of the concepts that you're referring to, they are basically referring to climate action in different spheres or at different layers of society. And each layer is extremely important. Corporate climate action, while still lagging behind in ambition and impact, it's still very important. Governmental climate action, extremely important. So we have to perhaps do a better job as communicators of this process, maybe to simplify these terms, because each of them has a relevance in their own space.
While we're at it, and you just mentioned about greenwashing or climate washing, as we are calling it, where companies and governments make their actions seem more climate friendly than they really are. How do we spot it? I mean, it's happening in some way or the other. For people who are, let's say, not in this sector or not very engaged or know about these frameworks, is there a way for us to spot it?
Well, there are slowly regulatory mechanisms coming up to spot greenwashing around the world. There are some countries that are putting in place laws and frameworks that will prevent companies from claiming that their products are carbon neutral without sufficient evidence, or there is increasing scrutiny about the type of advertising that is being done with climate related terms. So I think that understanding is slowly growing. But at the core of it, the reason that greenwashing occurs, it's probably something that the environment movement has seen far before the climate movement became so important, is that from an emissions perspective, it's really hard to cut emissions. It's very hard, it's very expensive, it takes a lot of effort. There's this whole idea of you have incumbent systems. So incumbency of large existing energy systems, large existing production processes of companies. It's very difficult to actually change those existing systems over to cleaner, low carbon systems. And a lot of companies, for example, rather than make the necessary investments to switch over to those cleaner technologies or switch over to more efficient processes, they choose to take the easier route of making a few small tweaks and then marketing them as major changes that they may have made. And one of the big driving factors of that is this global pressure and scrutiny that is now happening. So not only through the UN processes is there a lot of scrutiny and understanding that companies are causing a big part of the climate crisis, there's an attachment to money as well. Shareholders of different companies are now becoming very aware that the companies they've invested in are big polluters and they are demanding that they take action to reduce emissions. Investors, as I was mentioning earlier, are looking for greener companies to invest in. Consumers are making certain choices, conscious choices in terms of, which products have a cleaner production process, which products have a more polluting production process. The impact of all of these different types of awareness is still at the highest possible level, but this awareness is growing. So companies are becoming more, I would say, nervous in a sense that there's scrutiny about the way that they're going about their operations. So there is this incentive to try to inflate the kind of the impact and effort that they are undertaking. And sometimes, to undertake real emission reductions, it's just a very expensive and tedious process, and not everybody wants to do that. So greenwashing is just an easier way out.
It seems there are so many layers to climate action. While we are tackling climate change, there are also greenwashing and climate washing happening. So certainly we spoke about the role of an individual, the role of government, the role of corporates, global collaborations. How does events like fit into this? And we're talking about, these global platforms, which are very important for economies to come together and discuss and negotiate around climate related goals. But what actually happens at COP? Who are these major players that participate in such a forum? And what kind of decisions come out of these conferences which would impact countries like India or emerging economies?
Yeah, that's a very important and difficult to answer question, but I'll definitely do my best. So the COP, essentially, it's a UN convened space that it's an annual meeting that the UN has been facilitating every year, except for 1 year due to COVID. It didn't occur, but otherwise every year since 1995, about 200 countries have been coming together to discuss, negotiate, deliberate on how they can work together to tackle climate change in a sense. So that is the space that COP provides. Now, why is it important? So, in terms of responses to the climate crisis, I mentioned earlier that there are so many different levels of action. You have individual action, domestic action, private action, and so on. But at the end of the day, if you talk about the private sector, which is today very active in thinking through climate solutions, the private sector at the end of the day, particularly private companies, private financiers, they ultimately have a duty to their shareholders and a duty to turn profits from the sale of their products or services. So there is a certain element of self-interest that is involved in the private sector by its very nature. Now, climate change as a big, messy, economy-wide problem, it requires a lot of action and effort just purely in the public interest. So climate action is a global public good, as many would say. There isn't, for example, every arena of climate action does not necessarily generate a profit. We need funding to go towards climate adaptation or towards paying for losses and damages from climate change. There's no money to be made there. There's no shareholder benefit in those cases. Despite all the private sector enthusiasm towards thinking about climate solutions, which is very important, the overall coordinated effort to drive countries towards a more climate-ready future has to happen by governments. It has to happen not just by one government or a few big governments together. All countries of the world have to collaborate multilaterally, brainstorm the best ways of tackling climate change. So it has to be a government-driven process, and the COP provides that space. So it's very unique. The COP is governed by, and I promise not to get get into too much jargon, but the COP is governed by a UN body or a convention, UN overarching UN agreement called the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. That's the governing body of the United Nations for climate action. The UNFCCC, under that, countries that are members or signatories to the UNFCCC, which is almost all countries of the world, about 200 odd countries, it's a consensus-based process. If you are a member of the UNFCCC and you are meeting every year at these COP summits that the UNFCCC is convening, any decision taken under the UNFCCC, every single country has to agree and say yes to any decision being passed. So the UNFCCC provides a very unique space for rich countries, poor countries, middle-level, middle-income countries to all have a voice in climate governance of the world. So from that perspective, it's a very democratic space in theory. And I say in theory because the reality plays out a little bit differently, but that's a conversation maybe further on or down in this chat. But the COP is extremely important to kind of guide global level climate action and to also provide a lot of the signals that are then up by the private sector, by national governments, by individual communities in terms of where climate action should go next.
So, in a way, I think we can say that while these conversations do happen at a very global level, but it certainly has an impact on each country, their climate goals, and how they move forward in this entire energy transition journey. And which certainly also makes me come to the point that it has some impact, or rather more than, we truly understand impact on our daily life. So whether we are going to these conferences and we are talking about goals like how much percentage of clean energy we would want to generate and support our energy demands, it eventually has an impact on people like all of us. We are setting up some ambitious goals out there. We are sort of charting the way we want to transition to clean energy. It certainly appears that there is a role for an individual to also play, because they are the ones who are going to eventually get impacted, because they are the consumers of the energy demands that we are talking about. Can you help us put this into more perspective for people who are listening in today to understand it better, that how these conferences, while they are global in nature, ultimately does affect our lives?
Yes, absolutely. So, in terms of how the impacts of these conversations happening at this very macro multilateral level trickles down into our daily lives, you're slowly seeing some of the changes around you every day. So electric vehicles, for example, as recently as 5 years ago, they constituted a negligible share of the overall share of vehicles on the road. In 2022, car out of every 7 cars that were sold globally was an electric vehicle in 2022. And that's a kind of shift that is occurring in response to some of these global signals that are set at the COP. So the awareness and understanding of the climate crisis, in a sense, really converged first at this multilateral level. Going back to the history a little bit, the UN formed the IPCC, its climate science body, in 1988. In 1992, the UN formed the UNFCCC, which is its climate governance body. The first climate conference took place in 1995, the first COP. So almost more than 30 years ago, the understanding and awareness of the climate problem really occurred first at this multilateral level, countries coming together and brainstorming. And year on year, of course, this process has been fed by the science. So about every 7 years or so, the IPCC publishes a massive climate science report called the IPCC assessment reports. So the scientific process is feeding knowledge into this multilateral governance process. The governance process is deciding each year what global signals to set. So whether it was the first climate agreement that was set in 1997, the Kyoto Protocol, or the second climate agreement that was signed in 2015, the Paris Agreement, those are these top-down signals that have been provided by different countries in terms of how the world should proceed on the climate crisis. Those signals are then picked up by country governments in the types of individual climate pledges or promises that they make. The signals are picked up by the private sector, by startups, by innovators, by investors in terms of what are the next generation of technologies that we should be researching, we should be investing in. What are the energy systems of the future going to look like? In interpreting those signals, you then start seeing production processes, manufacturing processes changing slowly. So companies then, if you stick with the thread of electric vehicles, governments then start deciding to perhaps give some kind of subsidy support to different companies to start doing research on electric vehicle batteries and technology. That technology evolves and then companies start producing those. Consumers, on the other hand, are also seeing these signals coming from these global forums. कि अच्छा climate change हो रहा है. Are some of these choices affordable for me or not? That is always a big consideration. And over time, when more investment is done in these technologies, both from an R&D perspective as well as a deployment and rollout perspective, their costs drop and they become more affordable to consumers. So now you have more individuals on the street who are able to either buy an electric vehicle, or you have more governments that are able to purchase electric buses or electrify their public transportation. So these are some of the very real economy impacts that trickle down from this global COP process, kind of an interpretation of the signals that are coming from those spaces and converting them into real life related changes, economy wide changes that affect you and me and others around us.
Absolutely. I think, like I was saying, that I don't think anyone on this planet can now say that these things don't affect me. Climate is impacting everyone living today. So it's important to understand our roles in these climate discussions and actions. Since we were talking about history, and you just mentioned two of the most important agreements in the COP history, the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement that happened in 2015. Why are they considered as the turning points in the fight against climate change?
So, when countries came together to decide what is the best way forward to tackle the climate problem, there are certain peculiarities of the climate crisis that have to be kept in mind. The first is that the causes of the climate crisis are certain actors. The second is that the impacts are felt by certain actors. So I'll start with the causes. The primary source of global warming is through excess greenhouse gases, which are accumulated in the atmosphere. So carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and similar. These are planet warming gases. Now, many of these gases, particularly carbon dioxide, have a long lifetime. So once carbon dioxide is emitted into the atmosphere, it stays in the atmosphere for about 150 to 200 years and continues to warm the planet before it is absorbed through various carbon sinks. Now, as a result of that, a lot of the carbon dioxide warming the atmosphere today was emitted 100 years ago. Who was emitting those emissions 100 years ago? India was not emitting much. India was a colonized country. It was quite poor. Frankly, nor was China. It was your wealthy industrialized countries, primarily the G7 countries and a few others, who really kicked off the Industrial Revolution in between 1870 to 1900. So essentially, you have countries like the US, European Union, Japan, Australia, Canada, and similar countries who basically exploited coal as the first fossil fuel and used it to build up industrial processes, become extremely rich. Of course, there were other factors like colonialism, imperialism that also added to their wealth. But at the core of it was the use of fossil fuels and materials and carbon intensive processes that actually made them extremely rich. So, in terms of the causes of the climate crisis, and we have the data for this, about 60% of the carbon dioxide emitted between 1870 to 1900 between the pre-industrial period of about 1870 to 1900 till 2019, which is, you could say, over the century, has been emitted only by 7 countries. 7 historical polluters have emitted about 60% of all the carbon dioxide emitted since the pre-industrial period. So the responsibility to tackle the climate crisis rests on the shoulders of some of these countries and much less on the shoulders of poorer countries like India who are developing today and are today trying to improve prosperity. That's on the causes front. On the impacts front, all countries of the world are feeling the impacts of the climate crisis, but poor countries, developing countries, are feeling them harder because they have weaker infrastructure, weaker physical as well as social resilience to withstand the impact, fewer budgetary resources to bounce back after a major storm or a major flood or damages to livelihoods from various climate impacts. So everyone is feeling the impacts, but developing countries are feeling the impact harder. So it's this peculiar nature of the climate crisis that really determines how, if you were to create a global pact to address climate change, you have to keep these peculiarities in mind. So with this in mind, when the UNFCCC was formed as the governing body of the UN for climate action, it actually wrote in this principle called common but differentiated responsibilities and capabilities. So essentially, the principle of CBDR was recognized that developed countries have the responsibility to lead action on climate change because they are the historical polluters. Other countries should take action in line with their own capabilities and capacity, but the lead has to be taken by developed countries. So that principle was written into the UNFCCC. So over the years at the different COP summits, when countries started moving towards finally signing a greenhouse gas reduction treaty or agreement where certain targets should be set, um, and the world can then work towards some kind of target. This principle of CBDR was very much kind of a guiding principle for this process. So with that in mind, in 1997, the first greenhouse gas reduction pact was signed by countries who are members of the UNFCCC. This was called the Kyoto Protocol. And the Kyoto Protocol essentially set these top-down differentiated targets, so stricter targets for developed countries, expecting them to take the lead in cutting emissions. And these targets were emission reduction targets by a certain year. Now, this is where climate politics really gets a bit sticky because all countries don't really agree. You and I may agree with this process based on historical data, science, basic moral clarity, but all countries don't agree with that. If you are, let's say, if I am a major historical polluter, there would be a certain amount of pushback from my own domestic countries if all of a sudden I am asked to cut like 70 to 80% of my emissions rapidly at the cost of my own people. Yes, developed countries have a responsibility to take the lead, but they often face a lot of backlash from their domestic electoral base citizens when they are faced with such pressure. So the US, for example, did not sign the Kyoto Protocol because it did not agree with this process of richer countries having to take on stricter targets than developing countries. As a result, although the Kyoto Protocol was viewed by many as a very ambitious greenhouse gas reduction agreement, eventually it broke down and the world started renegotiating a new type of climate agreement where countries can do as much as they can in line with their own capacity and political, I would say, political space, but there aren't strict top-down targets placed on all countries. So that's how we then shifted towards the Paris Agreement, which was the second greenhouse gas reduction agreement that countries of the world signed. And that's in fact the greenhouse gas treaty that is active right now. We are being governed by the Paris Agreement. So in 2015, the Paris Agreement was adopted by about 200 countries of the world. very different formats. While the model of the Kyoto Protocol was that top-down targets will be imposed, stricter targets on developed countries, Paris Agreement was bottom-up. So it was said that all countries of the world must set climate targets, so greenhouse gas reduction targets, and the targets can be in line with whatever each country thinks that they can do and they have the resources to do. So it was a bottom up process where there's equal pressure on everyone to do some kind of climate target setting and each country. So if, for example, the US says, I will cut emissions by 5% in the next 30 years, that would be considered okay. They didn't do that. They set a slightly higher target, although not strong enough. But the fact is that the Paris regime created space for countries to set targets which were not in line with their fair share or historical responsibility. The Paris Agreement is viewed as successful by many because it had easier, it was better for coalition building. It was politically easier to pass. You could get big countries and big polluters on board by saying that, fine, we won't impose these top-down targets. You give us a target from your side in terms of what you think you can politically pass domestically. But a lot of people, including my organization CSC, believes that the Paris regime was a dilution of this whole idea of common but differentiated responsibilities. The fact that there has to be differentiated effort, greater burden on developed countries, much lesser burden on developing countries. But that's the reality of the world we live in, and the Paris regime is what we are being governed by today.
India also made two headlines at the 26th COP conference that happened in Glasgow, Scotland, where PM Modi, for the very first time, announced the net zero emissions target by 2070. Can you help us break down what these net zero emission targets mean, why 2070, and how we are progressing towards these targets today?
Yeah, definitely. So, under the Paris Agreement, countries have to make their own um, promises or pledges to cut emissions, submit those to the UN. And that, as many people might be aware, is called the NDC or Nationally Determined Contribution. So, NDC is nothing but a promise. So, for example, India has said we will cut emissions intensity of our GDP by 40 to 45% by 2030 compared to 2005 levels. So, that's one element of the promise that India has made to the UN. So the NDC is a short-term target. So it's pegged currently to 2030. And the expectation under the way the Paris Agreement is arranged is that every 5 years, countries will revise these targets and make them more ambitious. And every 5 years, so till 2030 is one cycle of NDCs. Till then 2035 will be the next cycle where countries should make it a little bit more ambitious and so on. So that's the NDC short-term target setting process. But also there's also the requirement to have a long-term vision. Where are we expecting the economy to go by mid-century? And what should the short-term NDC process feed into? And that is essentially the long-term target setting that India announced of net zero by 2070. So why net zero? For that, useful reference is that in 2018, about 6 years ago, the UN's climate science body, the IPCC, published this report. It was called a special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius. In this report, I think for the first time authoritatively, the concept of net zero was introduced. It had been talked about before that as well, but this was kind of put out as a headline issue in a UN report where it said that in order for the world to achieve the Paris Agreement's target of limiting global temperature rise to no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, the world must become net zero by 2050. So what does net zero mean? It means, as I mentioned earlier, that the total amount of emissions you are producing is nullified by an equivalent amount of emissions, carbon dioxide in this case, carbon dioxide emissions that are being absorbed from the atmosphere. Now, you produce emissions through burning of fossil fuels, transportation, industry, power systems, and all of that. You absorb carbon dioxide emissions through either natural means like planting more trees or enhancing certain types of wetlands and other types of nature-based methods, or you can absorb carbon dioxide through certain technological methods. So there are certain technologies like direct air capture, where machines are used to trigger a chemical reaction that reacts with carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, converts it into a permanently buried form, and reduces carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So these are the different ways in which carbon dioxide is removed or absorbed. So when your amount of emissions being produced is equal to the amount of emissions you are absorbing, theoretically you are at net zero carbon dioxide emissions. So this IPCC report of 2018 said that the world must be net zero by 2050 in order to achieve the Paris Agreement's temperature target of limiting global warming to no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. So that's why the net zero term really became very popular and mainstream, and countries are now required to set a similar long-term target of net zero, or some countries like China are calling it carbon neutrality. So China has set a target of carbon neutrality by 2060. Other countries like the European Union have set an earlier target of net zero by 2050. Keeping in mind India's status as a developing country whose emissions are still growing, India announced a long-term target of net zero by 2070. And essentially, the net zero target, the idea is that the short-term NDC target setting process should contribute to this long-term net zero target achievement. But in parallel, the government of India is also putting in place some sectoral plans. So the net zero target is accompanied by a document called the LT-NEDS, or the Long-Term Low Emission Development Document, where for each sector of the economy, a long-term plan is being developed for how it will contribute to reducing emissions so that India becomes net zero by 2070.
Okay. Um, Even last year, when COP happened in Dubai, it was considered as a pivotal moment for the climate agenda. Can you walk us through some of the most important outcomes from the last year's summit? And what was India's stand in the last summit? What uh, goals were we pushing for?
Yeah, absolutely. So in the Paris Agreement, there is a process that had been written into the document or the arrangement of the Paris Agreement, where every 5 years there will be a stock taking process of how much progress we are making on achieving the goals of the Paris Agreement. So kind of like a report card, कि हम क्या हम goals achieve कर रहे हैं, are we failing, are we ahead, are we behind? This process is known as the global stock take. And the first global stock take, the process to kind of make this report card of progress started about 3 years ago with a series of different UN driven technical reports, discussions, a lot of data collection, gathering. And last year at Dubai, the Dubai COP is where the first global stock take process concluded. So the first report card on Paris Agreement's progress since 2015 really concluded last year. Essentially, that document that was produced, it stated that we are far behind on the goals of the Paris Agreement, and the action that is being taken by countries, even despite this bottom-up individual target setting through the NDCs, the action is not enough. It's not urgent enough, not ambitious enough. And in terms of the way forward, where do we go from here? The Global Stocktake document recognized for the first time that fossil fuels are playing a role in the climate crisis. and that there is a need to transition away from fossil fuels and energy systems in a just, orderly, and equitable manner. Now, this sounds it sounds a bit jargony. It sounds also a little boring. Why is this? Why, why is this a big deal? हमें पता है कि fossil fuels are causing the climate crisis. Why is everyone so excited about this? As I mentioned earlier, the UN is a consensus-driven process, and for 200 countries to agree on a document which says that um, fossil fuels are one of the primary causes of the climate crisis, and um, we need to transition away from them. 200 countries are agreeing to this language in this document. In this, you have countries like Saudi Arabia that get most of their revenue from fossil fuels. You have countries like India who get more than 70% of their power from coal, which is a fossil fuel. So it was a very significant moment from that perspective.
I think those are very important developments that happened last year during the COP, and it is certainly significant for economies that are heavily dependent on oil and gas to come forward and agree to something like that. The only hope, of course, is that we are able to keep making good progress towards these goals, because that's the most important part. I think language sometimes is all part of semantics, but if you're not following it through, then it's all just a document. We've spoken a lot about what has happened historically in COP, and COP 29 is around the corner, and it's coming up in November in Baku. And it seems like Baku's anyway getting a lot of attention lately. My Instagram is filled with travel reels from there, and I also went there, and it's a beautiful place. But beyond the travel buzz, what's happening there? What are the big climate issues on the agenda for this year's COP? And what is India really pushing for, and what should we all be watching for? I think that's a very relevant question, right?
Yeah, I mean, great to hear that Baku is an exciting place to visit. This is good for us to hear because we will be there in a couple of months. And we are expecting a very different kind of very tense negotiations. So, well, I guess the easiest way to say this is that the headline issue at Baku is money. Climate finance is the biggest goal at Baku. So there is a bit of context in that the Paris Agreement, in addition to setting a sort of global temperature goal and asking countries to set their own bottom-up pledges or promises, it also had a provision for a climate finance target that rich countries should provide to developing countries to help them with implementing climate action on the ground. And this climate finance target is supposed to be finalized and negotiated in Baku. The process has already been going on for a few years now, and it's expected to conclude this year as the first time that a climate finance target will be negotiated at the UN level, and a certain amount of money will be agreed upon by all 200 countries, which then annually, hopefully, the rich countries will pass on every year to developing countries to help them achieve their climate goals. Yeah, very simply put, Baku is going to be all about the money. This is a very, very big and important milestone. I think at this point, it's kind of getting overshadowed a little bit by the US election, which will also be taking place at the same time, and the G20 summit, which will also be happening around the same time. But from the perspective of the developing world, to achieve some kind of an assurance for the coming years that, yes, our climate action will be financed and we won't have to bear the burden of cutting emissions and paying for it all by ourselves. This outcome in COP29 is very, very important in terms of just setting the course for the coming decade. Because, I mean, we believe that finance is a key enabler of climate action. you can have all the target setting you want, but if developing countries simply don't have the budgetary resources, the deep pockets to finance these emission reduction targets, they're not going to be achievable. So that's what we're expecting at Baku. We expect it to be a fairly tense process because, as with all issues related to money, there are very strong views both on part of developed as well as developing countries. Rich countries are focusing on aspects such as, there are large developing countries like China and Saudi Arabia who should now become donors of climate finance and should not be recipients of climate finance. Developing countries, including India, are focusing much more on having strong, ambitious climate finance target committed by the developed countries, which has clear provisions for climate mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage. It should be not heavily geared towards market rate loans, which can be difficult for some countries to absorb. It should be heavily geared towards concessional financing, which is either loans with lower interest rates or longer maturity periods, or it should be geared towards grant-based funding, which is ideal for most developing countries. So nuances like this are being debated and demanded by developing countries, including India. We will be there observing and influencing that process.
Like you just mentioned that climate finance has been the most important topic in many of the past COPs, including last year. And we've been demanding for certain funds to be created. There is one fund that was created, some commitments were made. What happened there? Like, I did read a report where it was stated that that commitment was made. However, it was conflicted where emerging economies questioned that, how were the funds allocated, who got it. So can you help us understand what major funds currently exist as part of the climate finance? How has it really helped? Or if it hasn't, for whatever reasons, the framework not being finalized or no accountability of sorts finalized at such a big forum, and what sort of kind of finances or funds are we looking at from COP29?
So there are under the UN process, there are certain funds which are kind of vehicles or bodies through which money can be channelized. And some funds have been established already. So the Green Climate Fund is a UN governed body that can channel climate related funding. The Adaptation Fund is another certain fund through which money is channeled specifically for climate change adaptation. A major development in Egypt in 2022 at COP27 was the establishment of the Loss and Damage Fund, where money specifically for the purpose of loss and damage, where climate related disasters causing damages to economies today, which are in need of recovery, rehabilitation. So funding for that can be channeled through the Loss and Damage Fund. So that was the most recent fund that was established. So these are some of the funds that exist today. The Green Climate Fund, Adaptation Fund are in existence for longer and come with their own set of opportunities, challenges. There are countries that do complain about difficulty of accessing money from these funds, bureaucratic processes, slow turnaround times, complicated documentation, which are pretty difficult for a lot of poor and developing countries to put together. The Loss and Damage Fund had its own specific politics around it because money for loss and damage is not something that can be invested, or you can't have any kind of return on investment or profit generation from those projects. Loss and damage has to be grant-based money to help communities affected by climate-related disasters recover. It was a long, hard-fought battle that was won in Egypt in 2022. And last year in Dubai, developed countries made certain pledges to commit money to that fund. Currently, the Loss and Damage Fund has about $660 million worth of money pledged towards it. None of that money has yet been given out or disbursed to affected communities, and that is kind of an ongoing process and challenge. COP29 is going to agree on something slightly different. It's going to agree on not a specific fund or an institution or a vehicle. It's going to agree on a sum of money known as the new climate finance target. There's a very complicated acronym for that, which will only confuse everybody. It's called the new collective quantified goal, or the NCQG. But more importantly, it's a new climate finance target that will be negotiated at COP29 in Baku. So that's a little different. It's not a specific vehicle or fund. It's a volume of money that can then be channeled through different sources. It can be channeled through some of the existing funds, like Green Climate Fund. It can be channeled bilaterally from one country to another. It can be channeled through the World Bank or the Asian Development Bank. It can be channeled even through the private sector. But it's more about agreeing upon an overall quantum of money that every year in totality must be transferred from developed to developing countries. So that's what COP29 is aiming to do. And it is basically a successor to the previous quantum of money that was expected to be transferred from rich to poor countries. It was a sum of $100 billion previously committed on an annual basis. But that's a number that rich countries came up with sometime around 2009. It was not a negotiated, agreed upon quantum of money. So the NCQG, the new climate finance target, will be a target agreed upon by all 200 countries in the COP process.
Oftentimes when all these countries and economies, they come on a platform as big as COP, while there are very important climate related discussions and agenda that is set, but it is overshadowed by the global politics overall and around climate, the many ongoing conflicts and crises. Keeping in mind what's happening currently in the world, what can we realistically expect from COP29? I know you mentioned climate finance is the most important discussion in the agenda for COP29, but do you really think this is the summit where we are really going to nail it down? We'll have something very concrete in place?
So a lot of people are expecting COP29 to be completely overshadowed by the US election, to some extent the G20 summit, but mostly the US election. And there are also some suggestions that the outcome of COP29 depends very much on who wins the US election. I think this is partially true. Maybe to some extent, some developed countries might be waiting to see whether it's a Republican or a Democratic government. But to a larger extent, I don't think it's going to make a huge difference either way. I think a lot of the pre-existing divisions and differences between developed and developing countries that have existed for the past 30 plus years are continuing to influence the NCQG discussions. And any outcome on the US election is not necessarily going to change that very much. I mean, let's say we have a Democratic win and Kamala Harris wins the US election. If people are expecting that the US is suddenly going to cough up billions of dollars in climate funding, that's probably not going to happen. Yes, if Donald Trump wins, it's going to be catastrophic for climate action. And we'll probably see the effects of that unveil in the months after COP, not necessarily immediately. But I think the bigger question really is to what extent developed countries are taking it seriously, the fact that without financing, you cannot ask for more climate ambition from developing countries, particularly countries where, we haven't achieved a level of development that is beneficial for all our citizens. Today in our country, we don't have 24/7 electricity access for 100% of our citizens. You might have close to 100% rural and all household electrification, but you don't have 100% 24/7 power access. So that there's a huge developmental need. There's energy poverty. There are, huge needs for access to nutrition, healthcare, all kinds of services. Countries like ours are coping not just with the climate problem, but also with a huge development challenge. And to place this demand to decarbonize our economy, shift to clean energy, shift to electric mobility, and finance it all by ourselves is a completely unrealistic assumption. So I think it's really a moment to test how serious developed countries are about tackling climate change, because if they are really serious about it, they will meaningfully and in good faith acknowledge that they have to help finance this transition in our part of the world. And that's really what's going to be tested at COP29. I think all of the analysis and data is out there in terms of what are the needs. So there are processes known as needs estimations of developing countries in terms of how much money they might potentially need to implement their climate plans. And these needs estimations are all putting the needs of developing countries in trillions of dollars per year, not even billions. So huge sums of money are needed to bring about these huge economy-wide transitions. So all the data is out there, all the information is out there. So it's a question of what kind of political outcome will be achieved at COP29. And that will be interesting to see, but it will definitely frame the the rest of this decade in terms of how fast the poor world is able to cut emissions and decarbonize. COP29 will really determine whether they are given the resources, the financing to be able to do so.
Absolutely. I think every time when we are discussing about climate, we also talk about just transition, which means that we do not leave behind one single person while trying to move towards clean energy sources. Because, especially for emerging economies, it's important that development happens, but not at the cost of the vulnerable communities, because ultimately these communities are the ones to pay the maximum price for something that they aren't even completely responsible for. So certainly I think climate finance is very important if the world is going to talk about clean energy and just transition. We spoke about the role of governments, economies, private sector, and everyone. But just to bring back this conversation home and more relatable for our listeners, what is that one practical advice that you can leave our listeners with, which will help them stay more informed about these discussions? Because we have already established that all of this that's happening out there is very much relevant to us. So what can we do to make sure that we are participating in different manners? If whether it means that we understand these discussions, we ask the right question. And then the second part is, what are the actions that probably communities and individuals can take to make sure that they are part of the clean energy transition? And it could be anything. It could be we are dealing with a lot of climate related issues, whether it is plastic, whether it is water, whether it is air. So anything that we would leave our listeners with one or two advice.
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole list of kind of individual actions that one can prescribe, and there's a lot of people who do that, and I think that's valuable, no doubt. So, I can tell people to kind of cycle instead of driving their car to work, or, switch off a few lights and save some electricity. Sure. I think knowledge on that is really out there. My belief, though, is that a lot of those choices at the individual level require enabling environment and infrastructure, and it's counterproductive to place too much emphasis on that individual level of action. It's important, no doubt, but if we don't have protected bicycle lanes and street safety and flood resilient infrastructure in our cities, I could ask people to cycle to work every single day, but it's going to be difficult for them to do that. So they need that enabling infrastructure to make these choices possible. So I think as much as individuals can demand for more of this enabling infrastructure to make these clean choices, I think that's extremely valuable. So that brings me to the two things that I always recommend as individual level engagement. And these are not super popular. They're not very glamorous suggestions, but I think they're extremely valuable in the larger scheme of things. One is climate education and awareness, and the second is political engagement and holding those in power accountable. So, in terms of the first one, climate education, so understanding what climate science is saying and understanding what is happening in the arena of climate politics and informing ourselves with the right knowledge to dissect the greenwashing from the real useful information, understand the different types of solutions that are out there, or try to break through the misinformation, also engage on climate education and knowledge as much as possible. So build your own awareness, number one. Number two is honestly engagement with political stakeholders and those in power. So demand better from local level political constituencies, state level, even the national level political stakeholders. So in terms of local level, we should be demanding better street infrastructure, better public transportation, which make a lot of these cleaner choices possible. The subnational and domestic level, we should be holding political leaders accountable for the kind of target setting that our countries are doing and whether or not we are meeting these targets, what is falling short. So, more engaged civil society, I think, goes a long way in making a lot of these individual level choices possible. Um, so, a person may want to switch from, you know, a diesel or a petrol vehicle to an electric vehicle, but if it's simply unaffordable today or if there is not adequate charging infrastructure, I think some of these individual choices become difficult. So, at the subnational and domestic level, we should be examining what kind of targets our countries are setting, what kind of plans are being put in place, and what progress is being made on achieving these plans and targets. So more civil society engagement and scrutiny on these actions, I think, are extremely crucial because these will then enable many of these wider system level changes that are necessary for the climate transition to occur.
Absolutely. I think you made some fantastic recommendations, and that is what I'm trying to do here. Make these climate conversations, make these climate discussions easier for more and more people so that one, of course, there is awareness. They understand what the governments are doing, where all the budget allocations are happening, because climate change has a direct impact on all of us. And two, of course, only when they are aware, they'll be able to ask the right questions to the right authorities. So I think that is certainly the very first step anyone can take to be part of these discussions. Thank you, Avantika. I think this was a very helpful session, and hopefully, we were able to help many people today with breaking down some of those technical jargon and giving some insight into COP and what it is, because we have the conference coming up. There's a very important agenda of finance there. So, hopefully, people will be interested to know more about that because ultimately it is going to impact our futures. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Arpita, and really enjoyed this conversation.
Likewise. Thank you.